Yeah, that's great. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, lovely.
So díobh chuirde go léir tá fáilte rih chách go dtí an céad lá orpach den ceol ársa nach ionintach an rud é sin. Bhhailm ar dúas buochas sa gháil le Institút de Móra an seo in Ollscoil na HÉir an Gaillimh, an chlár MA i Léon na Maníis agus Cimlo Pret. Bhhailm freisin buochas mór a gháil le Mórí Thrónín agus féle ceolar san na Gaillimhe don obair go léireann dhéanann siad ar son an ceol starúil in Éireann. So, buochas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to Ireland's contribution to this very first European Day of Early Music, run throughout Europe by the European Early Music Network today. And so we're very privileged and pleased and honoured to host the Irish part of this wonderful event which is taking place all over Europe today. So we hope that you will tune in to some of the other events that are happening this evening after this performance in Ireland, because there are performances from Germany and Italy and all sorts of other interesting places that are happening later on today. My name is Siobhan Armstrong. I run the Historical Harp Society of Ireland here. And my job, as I see it when I'm at home, is to promote the early harp of Ireland. And that harp is, of course, our national emblem. Let me show you what it looks like. This is the instrument, which is the Irish national emblem. And this is a very unusual thing for a country to have a musical instrument as its national emblem. But here in Ireland, we've been playing the harp since before the year 1000. And we played more or less the same kind of instrument until it died out in the years following 1800. Of course, the harp wasn't invented in exactly the year 1000, so we suspect that the history of this instrument in Ireland must go back another 100 to 200 years. So I think we can safely say that in Ireland we've been playing the early Irish harp for 1,000 years, and that really is quite a noble and illustrious history of which we're very proud. So we thought it would be fun to share that with you here in Galway at the National University of Ireland today, and with the people who are listening on the internet. Just to say the thank yous again that I said in Irish when I began. I'm very pleased to be here, and we have many people to thank for the fact that this event is taking place today. Number one, we're here at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and we have the Moore Institute to thank for our presence here today, and also the MA in Medieval Studies and Cimlo Pret, who kindly invited us here. But somebody I really want to thank very much indeed, not only for today, and that is Maura O'Croneen and all our colleagues at Galway Early Music, who run a wonderful festival each May, which has an international audience in this beautiful medieval city of Galway. Not just for today, but for all the work that Galway Early Music do to present historical music in Ireland and to give foreign and Irish musicians the opportunity to perform here in this city. So thank you very much. As I say, the instrument that I'm presenting today is the early Irish harp, which was played for some 1,000 years. The instrument I've just showed you is, in fact, a copy of the Trinity College harp, also known as the Brian Boru harp. And this harp we can't quite date yet because no carbon testing has been done on many of the extant instruments, though that work has begun. There are 16 or 18 possibly either harps or fragments of harps which still survive in Ireland, and also in the Scottish Highlands, which is the other home of this harp, because this is the harp of Gaelic culture, and Gaelic culture doesn't just belong to Ireland, it belongs also to the Scottish Highlands and Islands. And that part of Scotland and Ireland were once one Gaelic nation, with people travelling back and forth across the water which divides the two. We shared a language, we shared a law system, we shared syllabic bardic poetry and a language, and we shared music, and we shared this instrument. So this is the early harp of Gaeldom. Harps existed in the Far and Middle East from maybe 3000 BC in such cultures as Mesopotamia, Egypt, and then the classical world of Greece and Rome. Triangular framed harps, such as we see here today, are visible in European pictorial evidence from the 9th century. And that is in some thanks to the fact that King David is usually depicted with a harp. In fact, King David wouldn't have played a harp in the Middle East. He would have played a kinnor, a lyre, rather than a triangular framed harp. But of course, in early manuscripts, you tend to depict people playing instruments with which you're familiar, not necessarily ones which come from their part of the world. So the harp starts to appear in Christian iconography, on stone carvings, and then in manuscripts and psalters from the 9th century onwards. Why in psalters? Well, because King David is said to have composed the Psalms, and in the Psalms we have constant references to music, to trumpets, to praising the Lord with trumpets and harps. And so, of course, we find depictions of instruments then in psalters. Records of harps in the northwest of Europe date also from this period. So in Scotland, harps appear on Pictish carvings on the east coast, and later they appear on early Gaelic stone crosses carved by the immigrant Irish community based on the island of Iona. By the 12th century in Ireland, we begin to have foreign commentators remarking favourably about Irish music and the skill of Irish harpers. Sometimes the compliments are rather backhanded, since not all of our visitors are necessarily our biggest fans, as you can imagine. I'd like to read you something from an educated Norman cleric who visited Ireland for the first time in 1183. Now, his fancy Latinate name is Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald de Barry to his friends, and his uncle, Norman Fitzgerald, was, of course, the first Norman invader of Ireland. So Gerald's impressions of us may be somewhat coloured by the fact that he's part of the new colonial drift into Ireland and we're the natives. Their external characteristics of beard and dress and internal cultivation of the mind are so barbarous that they cannot be said to have any culture. You can already see the curl of the lip, can't you, with our Gerald, quite a snob. They do not devote their lives to any kind of merchandise or mechanical art, for given only to leisure and devoted only to laziness, they think that the greatest pleasure is not to work. Judged according to modern ideas, they are uncultivated. All their habits are the habits of barbarians. Since they are so removed in these distant parts from the ordinary world of men, and consequently cut off from well-behaved and law-abiding people, they know only of the barbarous habits in which they were born and brought up, and embrace them as another nature. So clearly not our biggest fan. But even Gerald grudgingly had to admit that when it came to music making, that the Irish were incomparably more skilled than any other people I have seen. Quite a compliment coming from the same man. His description of the skill of the harpers and the sweetness and liveliness of the music is in such contrast to his other comments about us. It's interesting that Irish harping was of a level of sophistication which was in excess of anything with which he was familiar. And Gerald of Wales had worked in Paris as a secretary to Henri II, so he came from the height of Parisian culture and saw what was going on in Ireland and still thought that our guys are better than his guys. I'd like to tell you very quickly something about the role and status of the harper in early medieval Ireland, because here in Ireland we have a rich corpus of manuscripts in Old and Middle Irish, with the oldest European literature in a vernacular language. So apart from Latin manuscripts, our literature is really the oldest. And these narrative tales are full of allusions to music making. We know the importance of music in social life and also how greatly valued it was, with immensely high status being accorded to the harpers in particular. So at a Gaelic court, of course, the most important person is the rí, or king. The second most important person is quite a surprise. It's not a judge or a politician. It's a poet, the file. And the third most important person is the harper, who is a free man and who has great standing. The harper's honour price, for example, which was the levy fined on anyone who insulted him or injured him, was 4 cows in addition to other payment. Other serious fines are indicated for causing a harper to break his nails or to lose his tuning key. Sometimes nowadays people see harping as a folk tradition, and certainly the instrument that replaced the early Irish harp, the neo-Irish harp, which was invented in the 1820s, not as a folk music instrument at all, but which has become a folk music instrument from the 1970s, for example. And other countries, of course, in the 19th century, such as Bohemia, had folk harping traditions. But these are exceptions to the rule. In general, it's an aristocratic tradition which is played by aristocratic harpers who work at aristocratic courts for chieftains and kings, or for other aristocratic people. The music played by a harper at a Gaelic court was sophisticated art music for an educated audience. But because the medieval harping tradition was non-literate, we now have only glimpses of what that tradition looked like. So from looking at parallel traditions in Scotland and Wales, we can deduce perhaps that the complex metrical structure of the syllabic bardic poetry had its counterpart in the harp music of the time. The harper accompanied the performance of poetry, but also would have played the 3 kinds of music of which we're aware: gantry, gultry, agus suantry. Gantry, of course, lively music, so dance music; gultry, the music of crying and lamentation; and suantry, lullabies. So it would have played all 3. What makes an Irish harp in its physicality, though? What makes it different from European harps of the period? Let's have a look. For starters, this instrument is a very robust medieval design. The sound box is made not of 4 pieces of wood glued up at the corners, but one single tree trunk, which is chopped down at the top and the bottom, carved out at the back in the manner of a dugout canoe. So it's hollowed and then has a back plate added. Other characteristics are the protrusion on the front pillar. So there's a reinforcement of the front pillar, which implies high tension strings. And the very special thing about this instrument is the stringing material itself, because we know that these harps were strung not as in European harping with gut, or in Wales with horsehair, or indeed in other parts of the world, in the Far East, they used silk stringing. But here in this corner of Europe, we had advanced metalwork technology, and so it was easy for us to draw wire from the 8th century onwards. We have evidence of draw plates, so we know that that they could draw wire. And these harps were strung, we're told, with brass wire, sometimes with iron, with steel or iron at the top. We know that they also use silver strings and perhaps even gold. Gold is a more experimental idea, which our wonderful colleague in America, Anne Heyman, the scholar and harpist, started using some years ago. And I have now some 18-karat gold strings on my harp in the bass area. Why gold? Why wouldn't I just go with brass all the way up and down? Well, at the top and middle end of the harp, it sounds quite good in brass. In the bottom, the string length isn't quite sufficient for the pitches that we're trying to get. So a precious metal like silver gold, which is denser, heavier metal, sounds much better. So they're the stringing materials. At the base of each string, you can see a little horseshoe-shaped shoe, and this is made of metal and stops the metal string cutting into the wood. The other characteristic are the cheek bands or lethrint on either side of the neck through which the tuning pins protrude. These harps were art objects in the Middle Ages and would have been highly decorated. You can see some decoration on my harp. The original in Trinity College in Dublin is even more beautiful and has really exceptional carving. So these harps are not just working musicians' instruments, but they're also art objects in the household to which they belong. For most of its history, this harp was played with long fingernails, and that's probably in common with European harping rather than a difference. Only at the end of its life, in the 18th century, well, from the 17th century onwards, but mainly in the 18th century, the surviving performers, most of them seem not to have played with nails. This harp, the Trinity College harp, in its current condition has 29 strings. The original ones had 30 strings. And harps through the centuries, from the period of this instrument, which could be somewhere between 1350 and 1500. Again, we're not sure when the original was built. These are the smallest harps we have, this and the Queen Mary, which is its sister harp in Scotland, which is very similar. In the following centuries, the harp gets bigger and gains more strings, but remains substantially the same in characteristic. Nothing much changes except for the size. Irish harpers were not just active at home, but from earliest times seem to have travelled quite widely. And by the end of the 16th century, Galileo Galilei in Italy, the father of the, Vincenzo Galilei, the father of Galileo Galilei, the astronomer, describes an Irish harp in Italy for the first time in 1581, which he says a courteous gentleman of Ireland had shown him. So this harp has made it all the way past the Alps by the end of the 16th century. The German composer and musicologist Michael Praetorius publishes two very interesting volumes in 1618 called Syntagma Musicum, where he describes and gives beautiful depictions of all the weird and wonderful instruments that he found and wanted to depict at the turn of the 17th century. So we have all the normal stuff, and then we have quite unusual and exotic instruments. And on the same page he shows Die Gemeine Harfe, the usual normal single-rowed European harp, very slender shape, with gut strings, and on the other side he shows a depiction of an early Irish harp. He says Die Irische Harfe. So already at the turn of the 17th century it's in Germany. It goes as far east as Poland, as the scholar Sean Donnelly noticed a few years ago and has written about. There's a very interesting painting from Denmark, from Copenhagen in about 1610, which shows four musicians at the Danish court. One is an Irish harper whom we think is Darby Scott, of a famous harping family. Beside him is an English bass viol player, and behind him are a lute player and a flute player. This is a very interesting depiction because it shows that when the Irish harp left Ireland, that it didn't so much continue to play its own indigenous solo music or for the accompaniment of poetry or song, but it joined the ranks of consort music making in Renaissance Europe and became part of the broken consort. So this is quite an interesting image. Darby Scott would have come not directly from Ireland but from London, because there were a significant number of Irish harpers from the end of the 16th century all the way to the middle of the 17th, from the period, well, until the period where the Civil War breaks out. There are 5 harpers in a row at the English court, starting with Cormac MacDermott, who's working already for Cecil, Elizabeth I's right-hand man in the 1580s, and he joins the court in the early 17th century. Cormac MacDermott is a very interesting harper because he was literate. Most of the harpers at home weren't. He was sighted. Most of the Gaelic harpers were blind. And amazingly, he composed consort music in a Renaissance style. So he composed pavans and almonds, of which there were made about 5 or 6 in 3-part and 5-part versions. So he's quite an interesting character. I'll tell you as we swing into the music making, which we will do in a few minutes, I'll tell you more about the travels of the harp and more about the harper composers who composed for it and the players. But just to say briefly that the musical traffic wasn't all towards London and the continent. There was great movement between Ireland and Scotland, between the families and the harpers. So Rory Dowla Cahan, for example, whom we'll hear in the concert, is an aristocratic Irish harper who spends most of his life working in the Highlands in Scotland. And Scottish harpers presumably came back across the water to us. By the 17th century, the pattern of Gaelic society is so disrupted by what's happened politically between Ireland and its colonial neighbour. So the colonial expansion that has moved west in waves over the centuries seriously took hold with the Elizabethans in the 16th century. And there was a great push to clean up Ireland and bring in the English settlers to settle the land. And this had, of course, a hugely disruptive effect on society. You can't really have a culture where you have constant war and where you have constant famine and death and destruction all around you. So the Gaelic society that supported this instrument starts to fall apart already in the 16th century, and it tends to be also quite disastrous in the 17th. Because of the colonisation by the English of the Irish, the society which had provided patronage and support to the aristocratic harpers was itself in collapse. So the traditional patrons of poetry and music were now either exiled, or they were so reduced in power, wealth and strength that they couldn't show patronage to the harpers anymore. We know most about the 18th century harpers, many of whom now are travelling harpers. So we've moved from the heyday in perhaps the 15th and 16th centuries, where Gaelic chieftains and kings had their harper, and the harper had high status and had land and was quite wealthy. By the 18th century, these harpers are now travelling itinerant musicians. Gaelic society has fallen apart. Their new patrons are the remnants of that society and the new Anglo-Irish in their great houses. And so they travel from one place to another, staying for perhaps a week or a month. The most famous of these is, of course, Thurlock Carolan, the 18th century Irish harper composer, of whom more than 200 melodies are still extant. I must press on because we have to get to playing some music. By the end of the 18th century, it is clear that this tradition was dying out. And it is, of course, ironically, at that point that everybody sees that it should be saved, when it's really already too late. So in 1792 in Belfast, the spirit of nationalism was in the air all around Europe at the end of the 18th century. And a group of citizens came together and thought that they must preserve and save the harp music. So they invited all of the harpers to Belfast to play. 10 showed up. We're looking at really the remnants of a tradition at this stage. Most were in their 60s, 70s or older. One man was in his 40s and there was one 14-year-old boy. So out of the 11 harpers present, 10 were Irish and 1 was Welsh. That was, in some ways, a doomed project. It was an antiquated, archaic musical modal system which the harpers used. And they're now trying to carry on in a world which doesn't really understand and accept them any longer. The great good fortune of that meeting in Belfast was that a very talented teenager, a church organist called Edward Bunting, was commissioned to write down the music that the harpers were playing, to talk to them and to find out information. He became so entranced with what he was hearing, which was a completely alien musical culture to him. He was an English speaker and Protestant. They were Gaelic speakers and coming from a completely different background. But he saw the treasures in what he was hearing. And it became his life's work to visit the remaining harpers after the Belfast Harpers meeting of 1792. And Bunting finally published 3 volumes of music from the harpers. Unfortunately, his published volumes, of course, because he had to sell them. So for marketing purposes, your music at the end of the 19th century better be piano music, because that's the new fashionable instrument. Indeed, Edward Bunting himself worked for Broadwood pianos, so he was heavily involved in the new piano world. So he published his music for piano, but by great good fortune, his manuscripts have survived. And it is on these manuscripts that we can, in Ireland, base a revival of the playing of this instrument. There are other sources in other places. In Scotland, because there were Renaissance musicians, literate Renaissance musicians at work in the 16th and 17th centuries who heard Gaelic harpers playing their instruments, they were able to copy down the tunes, for the most part in lute manuscripts. Lute players copied down these tunes, so we can retrieve them from lute sources. In Ireland, we have Edward Bunting's manuscripts, and we have various other helps to us on our way to produce this early music once more, to have a historically informed performance of this earlier repertoire. Over the last 20 or 30 years, since the seminal work here in Ireland of Gráinne Yates and in the USA of Anne Hayman, we have had other people come on board to promote this instrument, to play it, to research it, to build it. So now we have builders in Ireland, in America, throughout Europe, who are building wonderful facsimiles of these harps. Some of them are in the audience this evening. So we're really lucky to have builders who build the instruments, students who want to learn, and those of us who are keen enough to keep delving around in old shoeboxes, trying to find how best we can approach this instrument. So thank you for hearing this very short little pocket history of early Irish harp. Of course, it died out shortly after the Belfast Harpers meeting. In the first 2 decades of the 19th century, this harp was gone. All the attempts to revive it had failed. And it was replaced by the instrument which is now sometimes called Celtic harp or folk harp, small harp, which I call neo-Irish harp, the modern instrument which is now generally just simply known as Irish harp in Ireland, which is strung with gut or with nylon strings with semitone levers to change the pitch, which is of course a radically different instrument from this harp. So if you bear with me for a few minutes, I'll just readjust myself slightly here, and then we'll press forward with a recital of music. I want to take you from the earliest period in Ireland right up to the time that this harp dies out, and give you a little taste of some of the things that I've mentioned in this very brief talk. Thank you.
Siobhan is adjusting herself. I'll introduce myself and just say a couple of words about the Historical Harpers Society of Ireland, Galway Early Music, the MA Medieval Studies. All these people have helped to bring this event about. My name is Maura O'Croneen. I'm the chair of Galway Early Music. We're members of REMA, or the European Early Music Network. New members, so this is our first event with REMA, and we're very, very thrilled to be part of the first European Day of Early Music. So the Galway Early Music Society organises an early music festival. You'll see here, this year it's May 9th to 12th, and we've been organising the festival since 1996. I met Siobhan, I think maybe in 1996 or 1997. And ever since, we've had a wonderful relationship, her bringing her harp down, and not only her Irish harp, she also has come with a number of ensembles where she plays the arpedopia and various other wonderful harps. Siobhan is the chair of the Historical Harp Society of Ireland, and that society is dedicated to getting the Irish interested in their own historical instrument again. As she's explained, it's quite different from the harp that's played now, and it has, an interesting, different sound to it, different music that you can play on it. And what they do is they have, first of all, they have harps to rent, They have teachers to teach. They run an international summer school in August every year, and there's information about that here, and I hope that people who are watching online hopefully will look up the HHSI online and see about that summer school, and in general are doing their very best to get more Irish people playing the harp. The MA Medieval Studies in NUI Galway is a I've forgotten the word that it's called. Multidisciplinary. It covers history, archaeology, languages, just about anything that anybody wants to do in medieval studies, except music. We don't have a music department in NUI Galway, so we're doing our best here, working together with Galway Early Music to actually bring some music in, because it's a very important element to medieval studies. So once again, I'd like to welcome you, and I think Siobhan is ready, and we'll go on to the concert part. Thank you, Siobhan.
So finally you get to hear what it sounds like after all that talk. The very first piece I played there was composed by Rory Dowlow Cahan, the aristocratic Irish harper who moved to the Highlands of Scotland for most of his life. And this was a lament for his sister, Cua Fiá Rory in Gaelic, a lament for his sister. Now, the earliest notated music we have in Ireland is, of course, monastic and comes from monastic antiphonries. So this is the plain chant that the monks in Ireland sang in their monasteries. Much of it is in common with European chant, but there are places where we have pieces that weren't performed in Europe, and usually these are pieces for the patron saints of Ireland, of which we have three, Bridget, Patrick and Columkill. So I'd like to play you two pieces of early Irish plain chant. The first one is from Trinity College Dublin Manuscript 78, which is an antiphonary from the second half of the 15th century, in use in St. Canice's Cathedral in Kilkenny. And it's a piece called Felix Hibernian, Fortunate Ireland, fortunate to have Bridget. It's a Brigidine plain chant. And the second piece is from the Inchcolm Antiphonor from Scotland, a 14th century manuscript from Scotland, with the piece Salve Splendor et Patrone. And the Splendor and Patrone, in this case, the patron is Columkill, or Columba, as he's known in Scotland. Of course, these pieces would originally have been sung and perhaps accompanied by the harp. So Felix Hibernian and Salve Splendor. The earliest harp music that we have comes from the very end of the 16th century. When Edward Bunting, the music collector, was collecting the tunes in Belfast from the harpers who was there, by far the most interesting of the harpers was the oldest man who was playing, Denis O'Hampsey, who, if we believe him, was 97 in 1792. And if we believe him, then that means he died when he was 112 and therefore lived in 3 centuries, born in 1695 and dying in the early 1800s. It's possible, I'm not sure I find it entirely plausible, but in any case, he was of great age when he showed up in Belfast, and he was the only one who still played with long fingernails, and he was the one who played the oldest repertory. I should also point out that the early Irish harpers played in a manner which was slightly different to European, slightly later European harping. Wales and Ireland both had the tradition of playing on the left shoulder rather than the right shoulder. So the left hand was the treble hand and the right hand was the bass hand. So this was the way they orientated themselves on their harps. I play many different kinds of harps, so I don't have the luxury really of this orientation, and I came to it too late to change, so I play on this side. But that's quite an interesting thing to consider. So Denis O'Hampsey would have played his harp on this side, played this very ancient repertoire, and one of the most interesting and oldest pieces he played to Edward Bunting was half a tuning prelude. You can imagine that a man of great age talking to this upstart 19-year-old teenager who's trying to copy down what he's playing, who comes from an utterly different tradition and doesn't even speak his language. That he's not so, perhaps not so entranced, a little bit crotchety, not dying to hand over the gems. And so Bunting could only get him to play the first half of this prelude. And the second half, he wouldn't play. He said, oh, there's no point in playing this music anymore. The people who could understand it are dead. And it reminds me of friends and times past. So he felt very poignant about playing this older music from a different age, and it sort of broke his heart to have to do it again. So he wouldn't do it. So he played only the first half. It's called Féach an Gléis, which perhaps means find the key. So this tuning prelude will be followed by a lamentation which was composed by the harper Harry Scott in 1599 for the Baron of Loch Moe. So Cua Crina an Albanig in Irish, Scott's lamentation. And my wonderful colleague in America, again, Anne Heyman, has suggested that perhaps every lament had its tuning prelude, and so she tends to put these two together, which I think is an interesting idea. So I'll give you the tuning prelude followed by the lament. first Irish song to be notated comes from Carrick on Shore in County Waterford in the southeast of Ireland, and probably went abroad with the Earl of Ormond, Black Tom Butler, the 16th Earl of Ormond, who was a schoolmate of Queen Elizabeth I of England, and who was a very Anglo-Irish Earl, and who built the only Elizabethan manor house which we have in Ireland on the side of the 15th century Ormond Castle in Carrick on Shore. He travelled back and forth considerably with his retinue, sometimes spending months or even a year in London. So it may be that this tune travelled with him. It's called Calín ó Costura Me, I'm a girl from the banks of the shore. And it was sufficiently well known that in England it was a tune to which songs were composed called Calino, usually spelled Callino, or Calino Costura Me, this one sort of nonsense word. So the tune appears in English language forms in the 1580s and is mentioned in one of Shakespeare's Henry plays. So Calín ó Costura Me, followed by O'Sullivan's March, which is a clan march. Now, I can't promise you the clan marches are 16th century. They may well be 17th century. But I suspect that these are some of the older tunes that we have. So Calín ó Costura Me, followed by O'Sullivan's March. English music or Irish music became more and more popular in England from the 1580s onwards. And the first collection, I think, apart from the Ballad Lute Book, where Colleen O'Coster appears for the first time in the 1580s, the first keyboard collection to contain an Irish tune is probably the Fitzwilliam Virginal Book, which is the primary source of English, Elizabethan and Jacobean keyboard music, with music from the 1560s all the way into the first decade of the 17th century. So I'd like to play you a tune which appears in that, but not really in the form in which it appears in the book, because it's quite Elizabethanized. And so I'm really trying to get back to the tune that it might once have been. And the hint for me is in the title, because the tune is called The Irish Hohone, H-O-E, H-O-A-N-E, The Irish Hohone, which means precisely nothing in English, as we all know. But what if it meant the Irish Ochone? And Ochone is, of course, the Irish Elas, the Ailasa, this word of lamentation. So what if it's really an Ochone? So I've sort of deconstructed the tune back to what I think it possibly might have been. And I'll follow that with the kind of music that Cormac MacDermott perhaps might have played when he wasn't playing his own music on his Irish harp. A piece by John Dowland, the Renaissance composer par excellence in England of the time, the lute song composer, lute virtuoso, Mr. Dowland's Midnight, which is of course originally composed for lute, but which I have no compunction about stealing for early Irish harp, as no doubt they would have done. So the Irish Hohone and Mr. Dowland's Midnight. you. I should perhaps have confessed that I composed some divisions on Mr. Dowland's Midnight. So so the second half wasn't Dowland, it's really me. But I think, again, this is entirely plausible, and it's exactly what performers in the day would do. So again, I have few compunctions about doing so. Irish harbours, as we've said already, didn't just move to the continent, didn't just go to London. Rory Dowla Cahan and some of his fellow countrymen did head Scotlandwards. So I'd like to play you two pieces now, both, I think, by Rory Dowla Cahan. The first in sources is known as Da Mihi Manum, Give Me Your Hand, and it has gone into modern Irish traditional music and is called Tuairdom the Love. So this comes from the Weems lute manuscript, which is a 17th century Scottish lute manuscript, and it's very interesting when Gaelic harp repertoire goes into these sources, because we finally have some bass hand to look at. Because when Edward Bunting, for example, was copying down the harpist music at the end of the 18th century into his notebooks, he didn't bother notating in general what the bass hand was doing. So generally we don't know. So it's an interesting conundrum how to accompany these pieces. But in the Scottish lute manuscripts, we see a consistency of approach, which is interesting. I'll play you this piece from the Weems lute manuscript, which has an absolutely simple accompaniment. It's really just a sort of ground bass, or if anything, it moves in octaves. And then the next piece is a perth, or porscht in Scots Gaelic. Perth in Gaelic or in Irish just simply means a tune. But in the 17th century in Scotland, it seems to have the connotation of harp tune. And to the extent that some scholars think that these porshts, these perthana, are composed by Rory Dowla Cahan, that they're his pieces. So I'll play you a perth from the Strelach manuscript, which is lost. It was an early 17th, mid-17th century manuscript, of which a later copy survives, a 19th century copy survives. Again, I'll play you exactly, more or less, the accompaniment that shows up in the manuscript, which is very simple, interestingly simple. There will be a minor amount of tuning between piece 1 and piece 2, but bear with me. Thank you. The collection where we find lots of Irish tunes is, of course, Playford's Dancing Master, which is first published in the middle of the 17th century and becomes so wildly successful that there are many, many different editions all the way into the 18th. So two of the Irish tunes from Playford, the Irish Bourrée and the Irish Trot. To end off, a few 18th century pieces. The first is again a very interesting piece to me, because it was collected by Edward Bunting from Dennis O'Hampsey, either in Belfast or after Belfast. And it's one of the few pieces where Bunting gives an indication of what the bass hand was doing. So that's one of the reasons I find this piece so interesting. And the other reason it's interesting is it's a set of variations on a tune called The Lady of the Desert. And there are 4 variations which you will hear, and 2 of them are remarkably Baroque. They're just standard Baroque divisions. And this we don't really expect so much from an Irish harper if we're not so familiar with the music. So it's quite interesting to hear that the composer, Cornelius Lyons, who was the harper to the Earl of Antrim in the northeast of Ireland, was clearly very au fait with the Baroque idiom of the day and had no trouble composing in it. So 2 variations which I find quite Gaelic and 2 variations which I find quite Baroque. And the theme at the beginning is repeated an octave down. So actually I've lied, there are really 5 variations, but the first one is just a repetition an octave down of the tune, so I'm not sure it really qualifies. For those who are absolutely fascinated by tuning, yes, I know, don't all speak at once. The reason I tune sometimes is not only to tune strings which are out of tune, but also because there are two traditional tunings on an early Irish harp, which Bunting noted at the end of the 18th century from the same Denis O'Hampsey. So one is an all-natural diatonic tuning, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and the other is with an F sharp, C, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C. So those Fs to F sharps I change sometimes to accommodate placing pieces in different places on the harp. One tune by Thurlock Carolyn, the best known, as I've said, of the 18th century Irish harpers. And this is one of his most beautiful elegies, written for Councillor Thurlock MacDonagh, I suppose Terence MacDonagh in English, Thurlock Og, young Thurlock MacDonagh, who was clearly an exceptional person in the 18th century because he got around the penal law system which forbade Catholics to own land, to be educated, to divide their property equitably, or rather they were forced to divide their property among all their children instead of leaving their estate to their oldest son. So it ruined all the estates. They couldn't practice their religion. There were many problems, and one of the penal laws said that Catholics couldn't practice at the bar. They couldn't be lawyers. And somehow this man was so exceptional that he was the only Catholic who was permitted to practice at the bar in the 18th century. So clearly there was something exceptional about him. And there's this beautiful elegy, a song which Carolyn composed on his death called Thurlock Og. So I'll play it for you now. And I'd like to tell you, before I do, about the source from which it comes, because that's also very interesting. The very first publication of Irish music in Ireland occurs very, very late compared to other countries. It's first in 1724 in Dublin that we have a publication of Irish music appearing on this island. And it was the father and son team of John and William Neal, who were the music entrepreneurs in Dublin, who were impresarios, who put on concerts, who sold everything from music to recorders, and who were also George Frederick Handel's impresarios when he showed up in Dublin. So the first performance of Handel's Messiah, of course, takes place in Mr. Neal's Music Hall in Fishamble Street, and the Mr. Neal in question is the son, William Neal. So here we have Councillor MacDonagh from that very first collection, which was called A Collection of the Most Celebrated Irish Tunes. Thank you. So to finish up, I'd just like to say thank you once more to the Moore Institute, to the MA in Medieval Studies in Kimlo Perrett, to Maura O'Croney in Galway Early Music, to my own organisation, the Historical Harp Society of Ireland, who've come together. It's been so much fun to be part of this wonderful first day of early music in Europe. So we send our greetings from Ireland to everybody who's taking part in the day all around Europe. We hope you enjoy all the other events that are carrying on into this evening, and that you really enjoy the day. So one last piece by Cornelius Lyons again, Miss Hamilton, a beautiful 18th century elegant piece to end off the day. Yeah, no more to say about it than that. Miss Hamilton, Cornelius Lyons. Enjoy. Retuning, always a good thing. Well, I said elegant. Thank you. So I'd love to open the floor and ask if there are any questions or any comments that you'd like to make or suggestions. Please tell me if I haven't positioned this in some useful way. Yes.
We were saying about the left hand wasn't recorded until the old man in Belfast. I was just wondering, was it since then that the left hand was recorded? Or was it always recorded since that date?
Okay, so the question is about the accompaniment hand in the bass hand, and the fact that it wasn't recorded until the end of the 18th century, and how has that progressed since then? Well, the the tradition died out in the 1820s. So that's the end of that period where we could have a little look, a little window into what the performance practice was in the 18th century, and maybe extrapolate a little bit back from that. The harp which replaced this harp, the Neo-Irish harp, which was invented in Dublin in the just before 1820, in the decade previous to that, that was a completely different instrument coming from a different aesthetic place. So instead of it being, it was an attempt in some ways, I suppose, to recreate the old Irish harp. But the man who invented it didn't have that intention. He was a pedal harp builder on Dawson Street in Dublin, John Egan. And he was simply building a small, portable pedal harp that the ladies who played their pedal harps could play when they were travelling. So that was his purpose in building it. So the kind of music that was played on that instrument, that had its sort of heyday for a few decades, and then it sort of died away, and it was really at the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, that harp came into its own again. So it was, the follow-on instruments were built by MacFall, also in Belfast. So it was Dublin, Belfast centred where the instruments were built. And that was really then for a different kind of music. They were still playing the same tunes, but I think they were approaching them in quite a different manner. So it was more Victorian parlour music than early Irish music. So the bass hand was completely different. So you can see in the kind of the reconstructions I've made of these tunes that basically the evidence we have from the manuscripts shows us that they were using parallel octaves, which is a big no-no in sort of 18th and 19th century European harmony. So it's a very different system. But if you look at sort of early medieval music making, where things move in octaves and fifths, we're really coming at it from that angle rather than being sort of an erroneous byproduct of the 18th and 19th century European music. So when people started playing that new harp from really around the turn of the 20th century, the performance practice was different. It was rather than coming from the melody down, from being a top-down system, which is the way medieval music works, that you might take the strong notes of the phrase and play them with your bass hand at the same time to beef up the texture. But the new system of playing, well, it wasn't new in Europe, but it was maybe a little bit newer for the harp in Ireland, was that you had a vertical approach. You had a harmonic accompaniment underneath your melody line. And so you had a more European style of harp accompaniment with arpeggi, with chords in the bass. And you can see on a harp like this, where you have a very resonant texture, thick chords in the bass don't work very well. They don't sound very transparent and clear, whereas they work much better on a gut-strung harp. So again, it was the difference, the physicality of the instruments determined the kind of performance practice that took place on them. So this harp implies one kind of sparse way of playing, because again the strings are so resonant that you have to have a damping technique as well as a playing technique. So when I'm playing, I'm really damping as many notes as I'm simultaneously playing with other fingers. All of that wasn't really so necessary on the new harps. And so the performance style of the less resonant strings, taking a European idea of vertical harmony and adding it to the music in a romantic kind of way, a 19th century way, meant that the bass hands that we have from those pieces are very different to the originals. So if we're trying to get back to an earlier style, they're not useful at all, because they have more akin with Victorian piano music than they do with early Irish harp music. But that's an interesting question. When do we start when do we start having bass lines? When do we start having something to look at? I think the earliest intimation of a bass line we get is in Cua Queen and Albanic Scots Lamentation, which I played. Bunting has a printed version of that in his 1840 volume, and he says this is exactly as it was played. Well, no, it probably isn't exactly as it was played, because there are things that are clearly pianistic creeping in. But if we look at the various versions of that tune in the manuscripts in which they occur and look at his printed version, you can see there's just an awful lot of melody playing at the octave. So that's the earliest kind of written down accompaniment that I can think of, apart from the Scottish lute manuscripts from the 17th century, and they're doing exactly the same thing. So that's very interesting as well. So so I hope that goes in some way to answering your question. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, what sort of wood were the early harps made out of?
Oh, very good question. What sort of wood were the early harps made out of? The traditional wood that an early Irish harp is said to be made of in Ireland, the box, the resonating chamber, is said to be made from white willow, from Salix alba, very specific wood. But of course, many different woods were used in the production of early Irish harps. By no means enough forensic work has been done on the 18 existing instruments, but the work which has been done to date has turned up other woods besides willow. So we know that they used alder, and maybe Natalie Serena, who's a harp builder sitting here in the front row, can also give us what other woods are used in the building of early Irish harps. Sycamore, some of them seem to be made out of sycamore. The downhill harp seems to be made out of alder. That's an 18th century harp. Some of them are certainly made out of willow. There's a question that some of them are made from hornbeam and other woods, possibly fruit woods for the necks and pillars. So all different kinds of things. The thing that the wood that you build a resonating chamber out of, the characteristic that whatever wood you use, that it has to have is flexibility. Because you can see with this kind of harp that do you see there's a sort of bellying up this way, and there's also a bellying up this way across the soundboard. And when these instruments, when at least some of them were built, and certainly when this one was built, it was built flat. And it's the tension of the strings which pulls the belly up, which creates this beautiful sound-making chamber. So you have to have a very flexible wood to do that, otherwise you get cracking and it self-destructs. So you have to have a flexible wood for this. And the other pieces, I suppose, are a little bit more negotiable. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the sources which you use for this for reconstructing the repertoire for this part?
Okay, so the next question is about sources. How do we go about historically informed performance on an instrument which has died out? So this is true all across Europe when you're looking at lutes, viols, harps, instruments which have died out. How do you reapproach the technique and the aesthetic and the playing? We're quite lucky that we have 18 surviving instruments for starters. Ireland, Wales and Spain are probably the countries in Europe where harps had most prominence. So Spain has quite a few surviving harps. Wales has some, but between Ireland and Scotland and the Highlands of Scotland, we have 18 surviving instruments. So already that you can learn a lot from the physicality of an instrument as to how to approach it, by building facsimiles, by using plausible stringing. All of those things will teach you what works and what doesn't work. It's like the question about what does the bass hand do. You very quickly figure out what doesn't work, and then you can slowly approach what does work. The main source that I use here in Ireland is, of course, the manuscript notebooks of Edward Bunting, because they're really the Bible for a reconstruction of early Irish harping here in Ireland, because the manuscripts of his notebooks don't have the corruptions, if you like, to use perhaps an unfortunate word, that his published volumes do. Given that his published volumes are piano music, there's very little for us to learn from them as early harpists. Sometimes they're in 4 sharps or 3 flats, keys that are clearly not going to work. The other problem with his published works is that he corrects errors as he sees them in modal music. So he shoehorns them into major and minor keys and destroys the modality of the tune. So this is another problem. But none of these things occur in the manuscripts. So we can see what he's at on the fly as he copies down tunes from the harpers. He has no time to change it. He has no time to add things as he sees fit. He has no time to correct the mistakes. And so this is the best source of all, that I use, but it depends on the repertoire you're looking at. If you want to play the earliest repertoire, that is, of course, plain chant from the antiphonries. So you better go and look at manuscripts of antiphonries, learn how to read the neumes, approach the Latin, see where the word stresses are, see how you will approach that music. So there are several antiphonries here in Ireland extant, and some in Scotland. So that's a source for the earliest vocal music. Apart from that, I suppose we have, because much of the repertoire wasn't recorded before the 18th century here in Ireland, we don't have so much before the Bunting manuscripts. However, in the other homeland of this harp, in the Scottish Highlands, because Renaissance musicians were present, there's a body of the 17th century repertoire for this instrument extant in mainly in lute manuscripts of the late 16th, but usually the early to mid 17th century, where we can take back that repertoire from those sources. So they're the ones that instantly spring to mind. There are, of course, others, but they're the most important ones that spring to mind for me. Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about, or talk about the early Irish harp in Ireland now?
Oh, well, I think things look bright for the instrument here and internationally. As you know, we've had the Historical Harp Society of Ireland for the last 10 years. So I founded it in those dark days 10 years ago when not much was happening. And now I find myself surrounded by early harp friends in all directions in Ireland. So I think things are looking quite good. We have harp builders here now, like Natalie Serena sitting in the front row, and Paul Doyle, Paul Dooley. We have many other people actually building the instruments here. We have probably 25 or 30 students on the ground who are all working towards different levels of performance, some amateur, some aiming to be more professional. We have, of course, our international summer school here, so people from abroad and all the scholars can get together here for 1 week in August in Kilkenny, and we can all improve each other's standards simply by being together. That's what I found over the last 10 years, is that the bar is raised every year for all of us, for the staff and for the students alike. So I think things are quite rosy. Internationally, I think it looks quite good as well. The work, as I've mentioned many times already, of Anne Hayman, who is the modern doyenne of the revival of the instrument internationally. But also other people in America. You have Cynthia Cathcart in Washington, who's producing didactic materials, as is Anne Hayman. You have Bill Taylor in Scotland, Alison Kinnaird. You have so other people you have Simon Chadwick in Scotland. Other people in the Gaelic regions have students, are producing didactic materials, are producing recordings. We now have modern technology to help us, so we have Skype lessons, so we can teach people who live far away, and students who live in the middle of nowhere can have Skype lessons with some of the teachers who play this instrument. So I think modern technology is our friend. Also with regard to the research for the instrument, that we can have, for example, the Bunting manuscripts, we can access them online. We can access even better versions if we go and get them on CD-ROM from Queen's University Belfast, where they're housed. So the omens are good, I think, for a revival of the early Irish harp. The time has come. I see the expertise around us. We have scholars of the calibre of Sean Donnelly here in Ireland, and Keith Sanger, for example, in Scotland. Colm O'Boyle in Scotland. We have all sorts of people doing excellent work. So the future going forward feels quite optimistic to me, I'd have to say. Well, I think that probably brings us to the end of this transmission. So it only remains for me to say thank you to all the people who made it possible, and to say to our audience on the internet that we hope you've enjoyed it, and that we hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.